Go ahead and get comfortable. Dim the lights, pull the blanket up a little further, and let your body sink into whatever surface is holding you tonight. Because what we're doing here is something a little different from your usual late-night content. We're going to walk through every layer of adult humor that Family Guy ever quietly slipped into your living room while the kids in the house either sat there completely confused or, more hilariously, laughed along without having any idea what they were laughing at. Family Guy has always been two shows running at the same time. There's the cartoon on the surface, the one with the talking dog, the evil baby, and the fat dad who fights a giant chicken for no discernible reason. And then there's the other show, the one running underneath, written for the people in the room who had already lived enough life to catch the joke hiding in the background, tucked into a throwaway line, or buried inside something that looked completely innocent. Kids saw the bright colors. Adults felt that specific private sting of recognition. Over the next couple of hours, we are going to go through all of it. The marriage jokes that landed differently after your own wedding, the drinking humor that hit a little close to home, the political commentary that was sharper than people gave it credit for, the moments where a seemingly simple scene was actually doing something much darker and more precise, and all the jokes that existed in a completely different dimension depending on your age and experience level when you first encountered them. So, settle in. This is a long, slow walk through more than 2 decades of adult comedy hiding in plain sight, dressed up as a cartoon about a dysfunctional family in Rhode Island. Section 1. The marriage jokes that landed differently depending on where you were in life. There is a particular category of Family Guy joke that hits you completely differently at 16 than it does at 36. These are the jokes about marriage. The jokes about what happens to passion, to communication, to the person you thought you knew, once the paperwork is signed and enough time has passed. Kids watching the show saw Peter and Lois as a comedy duo. People who had actually been in long-term relationships heard something else entirely. Peter and Lois Griffin are a fascinating couple when you look at them through adult eyes, because Seth MacFarlane and his writers were never really making a show about a happy family. They were making a show about a marriage that had aged past its romantic phase and was now held together by habit, children, history, and just enough genuine affection to keep it from fully collapsing. Every joke about their relationship contains that understanding somewhere inside it, and it only reveals itself once you've experienced a long relationship yourself. Take the very early seasons. There's a kind of joke that recurs constantly in those first few years where Peter does something enormously stupid or selfish, and Lois's response is patient in a way that feels slightly more exhausted than actually calm. She's not furious, she's not devastated. She's just tiredly absorbing the latest disaster because she has reached the point in a long marriage where she knows that fury requires more energy than she wants to spend tonight. Any adult who has been with someone for more than 5 years knows exactly what that emotional register feels like, both from the inside and from watching it play out on someone else's face. Kids watching those early episodes thought Lois was just nice. Adults watching thought, oh, she's been doing this for a long time. The second honeymoon episode from season 4, the one called North by North Quahog, is deceptively loaded with adult content from its very first scene. Peter and Lois are going on a trip specifically because their marriage has gotten stale. The premise itself is something kids have no framework for yet. The idea that a marriage can just lose momentum, that you can still care about someone while simultaneously finding the daily routine of being near them to feel more like furniture than romance, that is an adult concept. Children watching that episode saw a road trip adventure. Adults watched two people who genuinely loved each other, struggling with the invisible weight that accumulates in a long relationship without anyone doing anything obviously wrong. The episode has a moment where Peter finds himself more energized by the chase of being on the run from Mel Gibson than by anything involving his actual marriage, and Lois realizes that the only time Peter becomes the exciting version of himself is when something absurd is happening. That observation is quietly devastating if you've ever watched someone you love only come fully alive when they're distracted from their actual life. The cartoon frames it as slapstick. The emotional content underneath is something adults feel in their chest. Then there are the bedroom jokes. Family Guy was always very comfortable discussing the physical dimension of Peter and Lois's relationship, but what made those jokes genuinely adult was not the content itself. It was the context. In the episode where Lois works for an adult phone line, the joke isn't really about the phone line. It's about the way couples sometimes stop being entirely honest with each other about what they want and need, and the absurd lengths people go to navigate around that silence. When Peter accidentally calls the line and has an intimate conversation with someone he doesn't realize is his own wife, the humor for a child viewer is purely in the setup. For an adult, there's a whole secondary conversation happening about how sometimes people communicate more honestly when they don't feel the weight of their shared history pressing down on them. The marriage counseling jokes across the show's run are another category that separates itself clearly by audience age. Every time Peter and Lois sit down in front of a therapist, the specific jokes the therapist makes or the specific exercises they're given to do are calibrated for an adult audience. Children don't have a frame of reference for marriage counseling. They don't understand the very particular kind of embarrassment involved in sitting across from a professional and having your relationship's private difficulties turned into a series of actionable steps. Adults watching those scenes feel that embarrassment secondhand in a way that's almost physical. The humor lands because it's true, not just because it's funny. The jealousy jokes deserve their own extended look. Peter's jealousy, especially in the early seasons, is always framed as excessive and cartoonish, but the kernel of feeling that the jokes grow from is completely real. In Stuck Together, Torn Apart, the episode where Peter and Lois try a temporary separation because Peter's jealousy has become unmanageable, there's a moment where Peter ends up on a date with Jennifer Love Hewitt that goes badly, not because of anything dramatic, but because he's still thinking about Lois the whole time. Kids saw that as a funny chase movie. Adults recognized it as the specific, mildly painful experience of realizing that even when your relationship is causing you stress, the person you're with has become so embedded in your interior world that you can't quite imagine what it would actually feel like to be without them. The joke is big and loud. The feeling underneath it is very quiet and very true. Lois's own psychology, which gets more screen time in some seasons than others, is also written with an adult audience in mind. She has an episode arc revolving around her past, the rich family she came from, the version of herself she might have become, and the life she's been building with Peter. When she says at various points throughout the series that she chose Peter, that she chose this life, there's a flavor to it that's not entirely triumphant. It sounds like something a person says when they have made peace with a decision they still sometimes wonder about in quiet moments. A child hears reassurance in that. An adult hears complexity. The fights that Peter and Lois have about money across the show's run are another buried layer of adult content. Not because the content is explicit, but because the specific texture of financial stress on a relationship is something you genuinely cannot understand without having lived it. When they argue about spending, about budgeting, about priorities, about one person's idea of what's necessary versus the other person's idea of what's a luxury, those arguments sound like real arguments because they are based on real arguments. The comedy is exaggerated. The underlying dynamic is painfully accurate. Adults watching those scenes feel the recognition immediately and almost involuntarily. There's also a whole strand of marriage jokes built around the concept of growing apart in very subtle ways. Lois discovering she genuinely loves something that Peter doesn't, or Peter having a passion that Lois finds completely baffling, and both of them navigating whether that gap means something serious or whether it's just the natural divergence that happens when two different people share a life for long enough. The Kiss concert episode is a small but perfect example. Peter believes Lois loves Kiss because she's always claimed to. When it turns out she was pretending in order to make him happy, the show plays it for comedy, and it is funny. But the thing that makes it funny to an adult is the recognition that couples do this constantly. They perform enthusiasm for things the other person loves because they love the other person, not the thing. Most long-term couples spend a quiet amount of time pretending to be more interested in each other's hobbies than they actually are, and the accumulation of that small, affectionate pretending is one of the stranger textures of shared life. Peter and Lois's dynamic also contains a long-running joke about the way desire works in long marriages that is entirely invisible to younger viewers. The show regularly implies that Lois is more interested in physical intimacy than Peter, which is a deliberate and interesting inversion of the typical sitcom dynamic. That inversion is itself an adult joke. It's playing against the stereotype of the nagging wife and the withholding husband, and doing so deliberately, but you need to have spent enough time watching domestic comedies to recognize what the show is flipping. Children don't catch the inversion because they don't know what's being inverted. The anniversary jokes scattered throughout the seasons also contain layers of meaning that only adults access fully. When Peter forgets anniversaries, or when one partner's idea of what an anniversary should look like doesn't match the other's, The comedy is specific in a way that reveals the writers had clearly observed real relationships very closely. The gap between what a significant date means to one person in a partnership versus what it means to the other, the small, quiet resentments that accumulate when someone consistently signals that your milestones matter less to them than to you, these are genuine adult relationship dynamics being dressed up in bright cartoon packaging. One of the most quietly adult moments in the entire series involving the marriage comes during a Season 3 episode when Death takes Peter through his memories and reminds him why he fell in love with Lois. The episode, Death Lives, starts as an absurdist premise and turns into something that functions almost like a meditation on why long-term relationships work when they work. The specific memories Death shows Peter are not grand romantic gestures. They're small things. Lois laughing at a specific moment, Lois being patient when Peter needed patience. The show is essentially arguing that long marriages are sustained not by fireworks but by the accumulation of small, warm, ordinary moments that slowly become irreplaceable. That is an entirely adult idea presented in a show that is mostly remembered for fart jokes. The Season 4 episode that became known in fan discussions for its married couple humor involves Peter discovering that relationship self-help videos have an extended section just for husbands, one that is considerably more explicit than the part couples watch together. The joke works on multiple levels. On the surface, it's just absurd. But the adult layer of the joke is about the way couples sometimes handle desire in long relationships, the private negotiations, the different registers of need, the slightly comical gap between how we present our relationships in mixed company and what those relationships actually feel and look like in private. Only adults who have navigated those private negotiations recognize what the show is actually describing. And then there's Lois. Lois Griffin is a character written with a kind of specificity that children largely miss. She is a woman who gave up a certain kind of life when she married Peter, who genuinely loves her family while also carrying a quiet, ongoing sense of what she might have done differently, and who periodically reasserts herself in ways that remind the audience that she had a whole self before she became Peter's wife and the Griffins' mother. The episodes where Lois does something unexpected, where she rebels, where she reminds everyone that she has an interior life larger than her domestic role, are written for adults. Children see the comedy. Adults recognize the character's emotional truth. The entire Peter and Lois marriage, viewed from an adult perspective, is a sustained, dark-edged, funny, surprisingly honest portrait of what a real long-term partnership looks like when the romance has settled into something less electric but, in its own way, more durable. Kids saw two cartoon people in a cartoon house. Adults saw something familiar enough to be funny and familiar enough to occasionally sting. Before we move on, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from tonight and what time it is. And if you're enjoying this, a subscription takes 2 seconds and it genuinely helps this kind of content keep going. Section 2. The drinking and addiction humor that was never just about beer. There is a kind of alcohol joke that exists on the surface of Family Guy, and then there is the real conversation about drinking that runs underneath the show for its entire length. The surface version is Peter at the Drunken Clam, Peter cracking open a beer, the visual shorthand of the overgrown man-child who never met a drink he didn't want. That version of the joke is accessible to everyone. But the show's actual relationship with alcohol and with the culture around drinking is considerably more complicated and considerably more adult than the casual imagery suggests. Brian Griffin is where the show's real drinking content lives, and it is worth spending a significant amount of time on Brian's relationship with alcohol because it is one of the more layered and honest portrayals of functional alcoholism that has ever appeared in a primetime animated comedy, almost despite the show's apparent intention. In the early seasons, Brian's drinking is framed as sophistication. He has a martini in his hand at moments that call for a martini. He drinks with the measured elegance of someone performing a certain kind of cultured identity. For a child, Brian with a drink looks cool. He looks like an adult. He looks like the version of grown-up life that gets shown in movies. That's exactly the framing the show is working with. And it is also exactly the kind of framing that adults recognize as its own kind of commentary. The sophisticated drinker is a very specific cultural archetype, and Family Guy is very aware of it. Brian doesn't drink because he's refined. He drinks because he's uncomfortable, because he's insecure, because he has a gap between the life he imagined for himself and the life he's actually living, and the martini is the prop he reaches for when that gap feels too wide. By the middle seasons, the show starts being more direct about Brian's drinking as a problem, but in ways that are specifically visible to adults. There's a recurring pattern where Brian's drinking is connected to moments of failure or rejection. The novel that never gets finished, the woman who doesn't want him, the achievement that stays just out of reach. Adults who have watched someone use alcohol as a management tool for disappointment know exactly what that pattern looks like. Kids watching Brian drink see it as a character quirk. Adults watching Brian drink see it as a behavioral pattern they may have observed in someone they know, or possibly in themselves. The episode where Brian goes through rehab and then ends up in Hollywood is an interesting case because it plays the addiction storyline both as comedy and as something more genuine. Brian's relapse, when it comes, is framed in a way that is funny on the surface, but that captures something real about the way addiction functions. The joke is always there, but underneath it is a fairly accurate portrayal of the cycle of sobriety and relapse, of the way someone can be doing well and then hit a situation they aren't prepared for and find themselves back in the same behavior almost before they've consciously decided to go there. Adults who have watched someone go through recovery recognize the emotional texture of that cycle in ways that have nothing to do with the cartoon packaging. Peter's relationship with alcohol is a different kind of comedy because it represents a different kind of drinking culture. Peter at the Drunken Clam is not the sophisticated drinker doing it for self-image. He's the working-class American male for whom going to the bar with his friends is a form of social infrastructure. The bar is where the important conversations happen. The bar is where the friendships are maintained. The bar is where Peter becomes, briefly, the version of himself that can say what he thinks without filtering it through his family role. Adults from working-class communities recognize this dynamic instantly. The bar isn't just about the drink. It's about belonging to a specific social context that feels free in a way that the rest of adult life doesn't. The jokes about Peter's drinking are also, at a secondary level, about the way alcohol functions differently for men in certain social classes and certain generations. Peter's father, Francis Griffin, represents an older and grimmer version of the same drinking culture, one where the drink has calcified into something harder and colder and less communal. The joke the show is making, when you watch across multiple seasons, is about what drinking culture looks like at different points in a man's life, what it starts as and what it can turn into, and how the same substance serves radically different emotional functions depending on where you are and what you're carrying. Children see a man drinking beer. Adults see a generational portrait of how men manage emotional life in certain American cultures. There's also the episode where Stewie and Brian become drunk together, the one inside the bank vault, Brian and Stewie, where Brian opens a bottle of Glenfiddich scotch and shares it with a 1-year-old baby. The way the episode handles what happens when Brian is very drunk is unusually honest for a cartoon. He becomes emotionally accessible in a way he isn't when sober. He says things he has been holding back. The relationship between alcohol and emotional honesty, the way drinking can sometimes function as the thing that loosens the lock on the feelings that are too heavy to carry into normal conversation, is rendered with a specificity that adults who have been in real conversations with drunk people they love recognize immediately. Children who watched that episode saw two characters doing something silly. Adults watched a portrayal of a dynamic they may have encountered in their own lives. The show also plays extensively with the culture of casual acceptance around drinking that exists in certain adult social circles. The Drunken Clam itself is a joke about how normalized heavy drinking is in American social life. Nobody in the Griffin's social circle ever really questions whether the amount of alcohol being consumed at the bar is appropriate. It's just what people do. Adults who have spent time in those kinds of social environments understand what the show is pointing at. The normalization of heavy drinking as a regular activity, the way the bar becomes as automatic as going to work, the degree to which the entire male friendship structure runs through a setting defined by alcohol consumption, these are adult observations about adult culture that children simply don't have the context to receive. Quagmire's drinking deserves its own mention because it functions differently from either Brian's or Peter's. Quagmire drinks specifically as part of a social and sexual strategy. His relationship with alcohol is tied up in his relationship with women, which we will get into in a later section, but the specific way the show frames his drinking as both social lubricant and sometimes predatory tool is something that carries a very different meaning for adult viewers than for younger ones. Adults who have observed or experienced the way alcohol is sometimes used in social situations understand the shadow that Quagmire's drinking jokes cast. Children just see another funny character doing something exaggerated. Cleveland's relationship with drinking is quieter but also revealing. Cleveland is, for most of the show's run, the most domestically settled of Peter's friend group, and his drinking is always framed as moderate by comparison to the others. When Cleveland's life begins to fall apart, when his marriage ends and he eventually leaves for his own spin-off show, his drinking increases in a way that is played for comedy, but that adults recognize as the specific emotional drift that happens when a man's domestic anchor is removed. The drink becomes more central when there's less structure around it. Adults who have watched someone go through divorce or separation know exactly what that looks like. The addiction storylines the show does more directly, Brian's cocaine plotline and the episode The Thin White Line from Season 2, are interesting to revisit as an adult because they're handled with a level of accuracy that suggests the writers had done more than casual research. Brian's slide into cocaine use happens through a plausible sequence of steps. The initial introduction is framed as something that expands his capabilities rather than diminishes them. His first period of use is genuinely productive. It's the longer-term consequences and the loss of control that develop gradually, which is how actual addiction usually functions. The show plays it for comedy, but the mechanics of how someone crosses from use into dependency are rendered with more accuracy than you'd expect from a primetime cartoon. Adults who have watched someone navigate substance issues, or who have done so themselves, recognize the specific emotional grammar of what the show is describing. The recovery meeting jokes scattered throughout the show's run are another adult category. The AA meeting as a setting has been used for comedy countless times in television, but Family Guy's version of it captures something real about the culture of those meetings. The specific vocabulary, the particular emotional register, the way people present their stories. That suggests the writers had spent some time either attending meetings or paying close attention to people who had. Adults who have had any personal contact with recovery culture recognize the specificity. Kids just see a room of sad adults saying funny things. The running undercurrent of the entire drinking conversation in Family Guy is that the show understands nobody in Quahog ever looks at Peter or Brian and says what they're doing is a problem, because the cultural environment they inhabit has decided that what they're doing is just normal socializing. The joke the show is making, very quietly, over the course of many seasons, is that the line between social drinking and something more serious is often invisible to the people inside the situation. And the dark comedy there is only accessible to adults who have lived long enough to understand that the line being invisible is not the same as the line not existing. Section 3. The sexual humor that required actual life experience to fully receive. Family Guy is a show with a significant amount of sexual content, and it has always been. The Parents Television Council filed more complaints about Family Guy's sexual material than about almost anything else the show contained. But what's interesting, when you look at the humor with adult eyes, is that the sexual jokes operate on at least two completely separate frequencies. There is the obvious frequency, the one that teenagers could pick up and giggle about, and then there is the other frequency, the one that only activates when you have actually experienced adult relationships and their specific, sometimes bewildering textures. The most obvious example of two-frequency sexual humor is Glenn Quagmire. Quagmire is, in the show's own description from Seth MacFarlane himself, an appalling human being caught in a kind of extended 1950s party animal time warp. His entire characterization is built around sexual obsession and pursuit. His catchphrase, giggity, has become so culturally embedded that it's been referenced in other shows, other media, and real conversations in ways that have stripped it of most of its original context. For a young viewer, Quagmire is just the funny, sex-obsessed neighbor. For an adult, Quagmire is doing something considerably more complicated, and the show is aware of it. What Quagmire actually represents, at his most useful as a comedic construct, is the specific social figure of the man who has built his entire identity and self-worth around sexual conquest, and who exists in a culture that, for most of his adult life, applauded him for it. He is a portrait of a specific kind of masculinity that was normalized within the show's nostalgic frame. The Rat Pack era, the Hugh Hefner ideal, the idea of the charming rogue who gets away with everything because he's entertaining at parties. The adult joke that Quagmire is making, across the entire show, is about how that kind of man ages. He never updates, he never revises. He keeps using the same moves that worked in his 30s and his 50s and 60s, and the show very carefully reveals, in small moments, that there is something genuinely sad and hollow at the center of his lifestyle. The girls change, but the behavior never does. And the behavior never does because the behavior is covering something that Quagmire never examines. Adults who have encountered this type of person in real life, the 50-year-old still running the exact same playbook he was running at 25, understand what the show is actually observing. The character is both funny and quietly tragic, and the tragic dimension is entirely invisible to younger viewers who just see the funny. The double entendres the show uses constantly are themselves designed for two audiences. On the surface level, a double entendre just sounds a bit naughty and a younger viewer picks up the surface meaning and the slight transgression. On the adult level, the double entendres are often specific enough that you need a particular kind of experience to understand what exactly is being suggested. The show is very careful about which specific activities and situations it references, and the specificity itself is an adult marker. Younger viewers hear something vaguely rude. Adults hear something precise. There's a recurring strand of adult humor in the show around the specific awkwardness of desire in long-term relationships that we touched on in the marriage section, but that deserves more attention here. The show portrays Peter and Lois as a couple with an active physical life, but it does so in ways that are always slightly off or slightly complicated or slightly embarrassing, because that is an accurate portrait of what physical life in a long marriage actually looks like. It's rarely the effortlessly romantic thing that movies suggest it should be. It's more often negotiated, occasionally awkward, shaped by tiredness and daily logistics, and the particular vulnerability of being physically intimate with someone who also knows all your worst habits and least attractive moments. The jokes about Peter and Lois in bed are funny as cartoonish exaggerations, but they also capture something true that adults recognize and younger viewers simply don't have access to yet. Lois's backstory as someone who was wilder in her youth than her current domestic life suggests is itself an adult construct. The show references repeatedly that Lois had a significant sexual history before settling with Peter, and Peter's complicated feelings about this, the jealousy, the insecurity, the occasional wounded pride, are an accurate map of a real adult emotional experience. The idea that your partner had a whole life and a whole set of experiences before you, that the person you chose also chose others before choosing you, and that this information sits in the relationship in different ways on different days, is something only adults really understand. Kids see the joke as funny because Peter is being ridiculous. Adults see the joke as funny because Peter is being ridiculous in a very specific way they recognize. The FCC episode, which is called PTV and is widely considered one of the show's finest episodes from Season 4, is an extended adult joke about censorship and the specifically American discomfort with sexual content on broadcast television. The episode works on a surface level as absurdist comedy, but the real joke requires an understanding of the history of broadcast standards, the particular puritanical strain in American media culture, the fact that Americans tolerate graphically violent content in entertainment while finding explicit sexual content categorically more threatening. The song the show performs within the episode, about the FCC and what it does and doesn't permit, contains specific historical references to real FCC actions and decisions that only adults who have followed media history would recognize. Children laugh at the song because it's funny as a song. Adults laugh because the specific content of the song is accurate and the accuracy makes it sharper. The Quagmire double standard is something the show starts interrogating more directly in later seasons, and the interrogation requires an adult audience to work. There is a long stretch of episodes where Quagmire is treated as a figure of fun for his sexual behavior, and then a Season 8 episode that contains a speech by Quagmire about Brian, where Quagmire essentially accuses Brian of being a hypocrite who talks about progressive values while behaving in exactly the ways Quagmire is criticized for, comes along and scrambles the moral framework. Adults who have thought about the way sexual double standards operate, the way the exact same behavior is evaluated differently depending on the social packaging around it, recognize what the show is doing. The critique lands differently than the comedy that preceded it because you need to have actually thought about these things to feel the impact of the comparison. The show's treatment of Bonnie Swanson, Joe's wife, who is pregnant for an almost comically extended number of seasons before finally giving birth, contains an adult layer of humor about the experience of pregnancy and what it does to a marriage and to a woman's physical and emotional life. The prolonged pregnancy is played as absurdism, and it is funny as absurdism. But the jokes within it, about Bonnie's patience and impatience, about Joe's handling of her needs, about the way her domestic situation shapes her identity, are drawn from an accurate understanding of pregnancy's effect on couples that only adults with that experience fully receive. The jokes about Meg's romantic and sexual life deserve their own section because they function in a specific way that adult audiences process very differently from younger ones. Meg is constantly positioned as undesirable, as the girl that nobody wants, and the show uses this as a repeated source of humor. For a child watching, this is just another layer of Meg's misfortune. For an adult, the humor carries a different weight, because the specific emotional experience of being the person who wants love and can't seem to attract it is something real, something that many adults have either experienced themselves or watched someone they care about experience. The Meg jokes are dark in a way that only registers as fully dark once you understand what is being exaggerated. Barely Legal, the season 5 episode where Meg develops a crush on Brian after he takes her to prom as a friendly gesture, is one of the show's most adult episodes in terms of its emotional content, despite containing relatively little explicit material. The episode is about the specific vulnerability of a person who has been treated without affection for a long time, responding to any small gesture of warmth with disproportionate intensity. That is a real psychological dynamic, and it's written with enough accuracy that adults who have experienced or observed it feel the episode's uncomfortable truth through the comedy. Brian's awkwardness about Meg's feelings is also written accurately, as the specific discomfort of someone who offered kindness without wanting to become a romantic object for it, which is another very adult emotional situation. The episode that goes the most explicitly into adult territory in the first few seasons is arguably When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, which was initially banned from broadcast and first aired on Adult Swim. The episode contains material that was considered too adult for broadcast television, and returning to it as an adult viewer reveals that the banned content was not just raunchy but also involved specific adult experiences around money, religion, cultural anxiety, and sexual desperation that required a certain amount of lived experience to actually land as the intended kind of funny, rather than just as offensive. What unites all of this sexual humor at its most effective is that it requires a specific kind of adult knowledge to decode. Not just the knowledge that sex exists, which teenagers obviously have, but the knowledge of what adult sexuality actually feels like in practice, how it interacts with relationships and insecurities and history and identity, and the ordinary logistics of adult life. The sexual humor in Family Guy's best episodes is written for people who know all of that, and its complexity is only fully visible from inside that knowing. Section 4. The political and social satire hidden inside the comedy. Family Guy has always had political and social content, and it has always been controversial for having it. But the conversation around the show's politics tends to focus on the obvious: the episodes where Brian gives a speech, the moments where a character's views are stated directly. What gets discussed less is the subtler layer of political and social satire that exists throughout the show's run, embedded in premises and casting choices and background details, only visible to viewers who are paying attention to the right things. The show's setting itself is a political and social observation. Quahog, Rhode Island is a very specific kind of American community, a working-class former manufacturing city in the post-industrial Northeast, a place shaped by Catholic immigrant heritage, by union labor culture, by economic decline, by a particular kind of white working-class identity that is simultaneously proud and precarious. Peter Griffin is not just a funny fat dad. He is, deliberately, a portrait of a specific socio-economic demographic, and most of the political humor in the show makes most sense when you understand him as that rather than as a generic everyman. Peter's job history across the show's run is itself a social document. He starts at the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory, which gets bought by a cigarette company, which is itself a commentary on the way American manufacturing has been transformed and often degraded by corporate acquisition. He moves through various jobs over the seasons, most of them working-class positions, and each job change comes with its own set of jokes about labor, about corporate power, about what it means to be an unskilled or low-skilled worker in an economy that has increasingly less use for you. Adults who have navigated the American labor market in the last few decades recognize the emotional texture of that job insecurity in ways that children watching the show simply cannot. The episodes that deal with healthcare are perhaps the most politically loaded of the show's social commentary content, and also some of the most effectively hidden. Family Guy has done multiple episodes involving the American healthcare system, and while the jokes are always played as absurdism, the specific absurdity they're satirizing is always drawn from real policies and real practices. The horror of medical bills, the bureaucracy of insurance, the gap between what healthcare is supposed to provide and what it actually delivers to people without significant resources, these are adult political concerns that children have no framework for. Adults watching those episodes experience them as very dark comedy with a very specific and accurate target. The show's treatment of the church is another area of adult political content. Family Guy has been consistently critical of organized religion, particularly Catholicism, in ways that are more nuanced than simple irreverence. The specific criticisms embedded in the jokes about institutional hypocrisy, about the gap between professed values and actual behavior, about the use of religious authority as a cover for other kinds of power, are adult critiques that require some familiarity with how religious institutions actually function to fully appreciate. Children who grew up religious and watched the show saw the jokes as disrespectful. Adults who understood what the show was actually targeting often found the same jokes pointed and accurate. The episodes involving race are some of the most deliberately complex political content in the show's history. The show consistently uses Peter's casual racism as a device for exposing something real about white American attitudes, presenting his bigotry as the product of ignorance rather than malice, which is itself a specific political and social argument about the nature and causes of racial prejudice. Whether or not you find the execution effective or appropriate, the argument being made is an adult argument. Children watching Peter say something racist see a cartoon character being cartoonishly offensive. Adults who understand the social critique underneath what's happening see a show making a specific claim about how racial prejudice actually functions in white working-class communities. The Brian and Stewie episode where Brian admits he voted for John McCain while drunk is a small but revealing moment of political adult humor. The joke requires you to understand the specific period's political landscape to know what kind of person was expected to vote for John McCain versus Barack Obama in 2008, and to recognize the specific flavor of liberal shame Brian exhibits when the admission comes out. That whole emotional sequence, the drunk confession, the immediate regret, the way Stewie responds, is written for adults who understand a particular kind of ideological self-image and the specific pain of acting against it. It's a very inside joke about American political identity that children simply don't have the context to process. The corporate satire in the show runs deep throughout multiple seasons. El Dorado Cigarettes buying the Happy-Go-Lucky toy factory and using it to market cigarettes to children is a specific joke about corporate regulatory capture, about the American tobacco industry, about the ways large corporations have historically exploited regulatory gaps and public trust. Adults who followed the tobacco industry's decades of public deception recognize what the joke is targeting. Children just see a funny premise about a toy factory. The episode where Peter runs for school board is an episode about local politics and the specific dynamics of school board elections that turns on insider knowledge about how those institutions actually function. School board elections are among the most localized and most politically contested forms of American democratic participation, and the specific dynamics the show satirizes about them, the personality conflicts, the low stakes that feel enormous to the participants, the way local power works are adult political knowledge. Adults who have followed local politics see the satire. Children see a comedy about Peter being ridiculous. The Patriot Games episode contains political adult humor at multiple levels. It's nominally about football, but the American football jokes are themselves politically coded in ways that require an adult understanding of the sport's cultural role in American life, its relationship to masculinity, to patriotism, to violence as entertainment. The NFL as an institution has a specific political meaning in America that is invisible to younger viewers and very clear to adults who have paid attention to the debates around the sport, its economics, its treatment of players, its role as a national ritual. The news media satire that runs through the show is something adults pick up on in a completely different way than younger viewers. Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons, the local news anchors, are parodies of a specific type of local television news personality, and the jokes about their coverage choices, their personal dynamics, their relationship to the community they cover, are drawn from accurate observations about how local television news actually works. Adults who have watched local news for decades recognize the specific things being satirized. Children just see two funny characters. The episode about stem cell research, where Peter's stroke is cured in 5 minutes by stem cell therapy, contains a political joke that requires you to understand the early to mid-2000s political debate around stem cell research, the religious opposition to it, the specific legislative battles that were being fought at the time the episode aired. The joke is that something with enormous potential to help people with devastating conditions is being blocked by political opposition, and the 5-minute cure is a satirical exaggeration of what could be possible. Adults who followed that political debate in real time feel the joke differently than people who encountered it without that context. The show's political satire is at its most effective when it's least obvious. The moments when the comedy isn't explicitly announcing itself as political commentary, but is instead quietly embedding a political observation into what looks like just a funny scene, are the moments that work best for adult audiences. A background detail in a shot that comments on something real. A throwaway line from a minor character that contains an accurate observation about how power works. The choice of which specific celebrities and public figures to reference, and in what context. All of these small decisions add up to a sustained social and political portrait of America that is visible to adults paying attention and largely invisible to everyone else. Section 5. The celebrity and pop culture jokes that required lived experience. Family Guy is a show that runs almost entirely on cultural reference, but not all cultural references land equally across age groups, and the most genuinely adult humor in this category is not necessarily the most explicit. Some of the sharpest and most interesting adult content in the show comes from references that require you to have actually lived through a certain cultural moment to understand why the reference is funny in the specific way the show is using it. The show's relationship with Baby Boomer and Generation X pop culture is something that separates audiences clearly by age. Peter Griffin's obsession with certain films, certain television shows, certain musical acts from the 1970s and 1980s is written for an audience that has genuine emotional connections to those things. When the show makes a reference to a specific television show or film from that era, the humor often depends on you having an actual memory of the thing being referenced, not just an intellectual knowledge that it existed. Adults who grew up watching the original broadcast of certain classic films or television programs respond to those references with a specific warm recognition that people who only know about those things secondhand cannot replicate. The Conway Twitty running gag is perhaps the show's most committed adult joke. Conway Twitty was a country music performer who was enormously successful in the 1970s and 1980s, a figure with a very specific and now faded cultural currency. Using him as a recurring substitute for actual comedy is a joke that works on multiple levels, but the most genuinely adult layer of it is about the specific kind of nostalgic television experience of being flipped through channels on a Saturday afternoon in the 1980s and suddenly arriving at a country music performance from someone your parents' age. Children watching the Conway Twitty segments have almost no frame of reference for what the show is evoking. Adults of a certain generation feel the specific texture of the reference very clearly. The celebrity impression humor that runs through the show requires genuine familiarity with the celebrities being referenced. Family Guy has made jokes about hundreds of specific public figures over its run, and the jokes are almost always dependent on knowing something specific about the person's public persona, their reputation, the specific way they presented themselves to the world. A joke about a celebrity's rumored private life requires you to have followed the celebrity news cycle closely enough to know the rumor. A joke about a public figure's public statements requires you to have been paying attention when the statement was made. Adults who actively follow celebrity and public life find those jokes sharply specific. Younger viewers who don't have that background knowledge often just see a person's name attached to a joke without understanding what the specific content of the joke is referring to. The Star Wars parodies, which are extensive and elaborate and cover multiple episodes, operate at 2 levels of adult knowledge. The surface level is just that you've seen the Star Wars films, but the deeper level requires you to understand the specific cultural context of Star Wars, what it meant when it came out, how it changed popular culture, what the franchise's relationship with its own mythology and with its fan base has been over the decades. The jokes about Star Wars geek culture, about the specific way fan communities interact with the franchise, about the particular tensions between creator and audience that have defined the Star Wars experience, are adult cultural observations that only land if you've observed that cultural phenomenon closely enough to recognize what's being exaggerated. The Mel Gibson episode, which started the show's revival season, is specifically an adult joke about the specific period in Mel Gibson's public life and career when he was simultaneously one of Hollywood's most powerful figures and a figure of significant controversy. The specific things the episode references about Gibson require knowledge of his actual public statements, his actual films, his actual public persona, in ways that children who hadn't been following celebrity news couldn't access. Adults who had been paying attention to that specific story found the episode sharply pointed. Younger viewers had to work considerably harder to understand what the jokes were actually about. The show's relationship with the music industry produces some of its most adult content in this category. The jokes about specific bands, specific musicians, specific cultural moments in music history require the kind of deeply specific knowledge that comes from actually having been alive during those cultural moments and having cared about music. The episode involving the band Kiss and Peter's devotion to them is a joke that only fully lands if you understand what Kiss was in the cultural imagination of the white working-class American male of a certain generation. What the band represented, what it meant to people who took it seriously, and what it looks like from the outside when someone has organized a significant portion of their emotional life around a band that now looks somewhat campy and absurd from the outside. The dead celebrity jokes scattered throughout the show's run are their own special category of adult humor. There is a particular kind of comedy that comes from referencing someone who has died in a way that requires you to know exactly who that person was and what they meant in their moment. Children who don't have that historical knowledge can't access the specific emotional register that makes dead celebrity humor work when it's working as intended. Adults who remember the person being referenced, who have some relationship with their work or their public presence, feel the humor differently because it's making contact with an actual piece of their cultural memory. The show's movie parodies are perhaps the most reliable source of adult-specific humor in this cultural category. When Family Guy parodies a film, it does so with a level of detail that requires you to have seen the source material closely enough to recognize what's being exaggerated. The Shawshank Redemption parody, which is widely praised as one of the show's best pieces of sustained comedy, works because it pays extremely close attention to the specific emotional rhythms of the original film and uses that attention to create jokes that a casual observer of the film wouldn't catch. You don't just need to have seen Shawshank Redemption. You need to have watched it carefully enough to have formed a relationship with its specific timing and emotional beats. Adults who love the film and have seen it multiple times get the full version of the joke. Everyone else gets a partial one. The Bob Hope and Bing Crosby references that appear in the show are among the most generationally specific adult jokes in the entire run. These are references to entertainment figures whose primary cultural moment was the 1940s and 1950s, and the specific texture of what those references are doing in the context of Family Guy is visible only to viewers who have enough cultural history to understand what Hope and Crosby represented and why they're funny to invoke in the context of a contemporary animated comedy. Adults of certain ages who grew up watching old movies or whose parents' cultural references shaped their entertainment landscape find something genuinely delightful in the precision of those references. Everyone else sees a name they might recognize without feeling what the name is supposed to feel like. The intellectual cultural references, which Brian often carries as part of his character construction, form their own adult category. Brian's references to specific books, specific authors, specific intellectual traditions are jokes that require familiarity with those things to fully receive. The Henry David Thoreau pun, where Brian says that when he reads Henry David he tends to be pretty Thoreau, is a joke that requires you to know who Thoreau was, what he was known for, and to find the double meaning in the wordplay funny. Children who haven't encountered Thoreau in school yet are left with nothing. Adults who know the reference get the specific, slightly painful pleasure of a very well-constructed groan-worthy pun. The Dumont Network joke, where Death is the only character who recognizes a reference to the Dumont Network because the network is itself dead, is perhaps the show's most elegantly constructed adult joke in this category. Dumont was an early American television network that dissolved in 1956. It exists now primarily as an obscure reference point for serious television historians. The joke requires not just knowing that the network existed, but understanding enough about television history to appreciate the specific elegance of the punchline that only Death would still know what Dumont was, because everything about the Dumont Network, including the people who watched it in its original broadcast, is now dead. Adults with knowledge of television history find it genuinely beautiful. Everyone else hears a name they don't recognize and moves on. Section 6. The workplace and financial jokes that required working adult life. There's a whole layer of humor in Family Guy that only activates once you've actually had to work for a living, manage a budget, negotiate with a boss, or navigate the specific indignities and small victories that make up the daily experience of being an employed adult in America. These jokes exist throughout the show's run, but they tend to cluster in specific episodes and specific character dynamics, and they require lived workplace experience to receive at full strength. Peter's various jobs over the show's seasons are an extended adult joke about the nature of American employment. When he works at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, the specific texture of the jokes about his relationship with his workplace, his boss, his coworkers, his sense of purpose, and its frequent absence are drawn from accurate observation of what it's actually like to work in a job that exists to pay the rent, rather than to fulfill any particular dream. Adults who have spent significant time in jobs they didn't choose recognize the specific emotional landscape those episodes map. Children see a cartoon man going to a cartoon job. Adults see a portrait of something very familiar. The boss-employee relationship jokes in the show span multiple seasons and multiple employers for Peter, and they are consistently written with an accuracy that requires adult experience to appreciate. The specific dynamics of what you do and don't say to someone who has power over your livelihood, the way you perform attitudes you don't genuinely feel because the economic stakes demand performance, the negotiation between your self-respect and your need to keep the job, all of these are adult workplace experiences rendered in cartoon form. Children watching those scenes just see Peter getting in trouble. Adults watch Peter navigate something they recognize. The episode about sexual harassment in the workplace, which involves Peter attending sensitivity training after making a joke that offends a female coworker, is an adult cultural document about a very specific moment in American workplace history. The episode was made at a time when the specific discourse around workplace sexual harassment was actively being negotiated in public culture, when the rules were changing in ways that not everyone understood at the same pace or to the same degree. Adults who lived through that specific cultural moment recognize the specific tensions the episode is mapping. The comedy comes from Peter's genuine cluelessness about how workplace standards have changed, and the humor only works if you understand that it is cluelessness and not just eccentricity. The financial jokes in the show are another adult-specific category. The specific humor of not having enough money, of making decisions you don't want to make because money is tight, of the particular indignity of being a working adult who can't quite get ahead, is something that requires actual adult financial experience to receive properly. Children living in their parents' house don't yet know the weight of a utility bill, the specific stress of a car repair that comes at the wrong time, the emotional texture of the conversation you have with your partner when the month ends with less money than you needed. Peter and Lois have these conversations repeatedly throughout the show's run, and adults who have had similar conversations recognize what's being portrayed with a recognition that has nothing to do with cartoon characters. The episode where Lois is forced to take a job answering an adult phone line because the family needs the money is funny on its surface, but carries a specific adult layer about the experience of doing work you find humiliating because the financial need is real. The show plays it as absurdist comedy. The underlying dynamic of a person doing work that feels misaligned with their sense of themselves because there is simply no better option available right now is an adult reality that children don't have experience with. The jokes about Peter's union, about collective bargaining, about the specific culture of labor relations in the kind of manufacturing and service economy that Peter's work world represents, are adult political economics embedded in what looks like workplace comedy. Adults who come from union backgrounds or who have worked in heavily unionized industries recognize the specific texture of those references. The jokes about how unions actually function, their internal politics, the tension between their stated purpose and their actual dynamics are accurate enough to suggest the writers either had direct experience with organized labor or had done serious research into it. Healthcare, through an employer, the specific American anxiety about losing your job and therefore losing your health insurance, shows up in the show repeatedly as a background concern that shapes character decisions. Adults who have experienced the specific terror of a job loss that also means losing healthcare coverage understand the weight that concern carries in ways that younger viewers don't. The show references this dynamic repeatedly without ever making it the centerpiece of a joke, which means it functions more as authentic background texture than as comedy, and that authenticity is visible to adults, but invisible to children. The Brian storylines about his failed writing career are some of the most specifically adult jokes in the show because they require understanding what it actually feels like to have significant ambition and significantly limited success. Brian wants to be taken seriously as a writer and is not, and the specific texture of that failure, the way he manages it through alcohol and pretension and occasional delusion, is drawn from an accurate understanding of how creative ambition interacts with limited public recognition. Adults who have experience with creative work, who have encountered the gap between what they believed they were capable of and what the market for their work has said they were worth, feel those jokes in a personal way that has nothing to do with dogs or cartoons. The economic class observations that run through the show's background jokes are consistently adult. The specific anxiety of belonging to a class that is neither poor enough to qualify for certain kinds of assistance, nor wealthy enough to feel economically secure, the working class experience of constant mild precarity, dressed up as stability, is mapped throughout the show in details that adults from that background recognize immediately and that children from comfortable households don't encounter. The Griffins are not poor. They're also not doing particularly well. And the specific quality of their not doing particularly well, the house that needs work they can't afford to do, the car that's older than they'd like, the vacation that always feels slightly out of reach, is an accurate portrait of a very specific American economic reality. Section 7. The dark humor about death and mortality that children simply couldn't access. There is a category of Family Guy humor that lands completely differently depending on whether you have personally experienced loss and faced your own mortality or not. The show has always been comfortable with death as a comic subject, but its relationship with actual mortality, with the real weight and texture of dying and grief and the fear of both, is considerably more nuanced than the bright cartoon packaging suggests. Death as a character who appears in the show is himself an adult joke. The premise of Death as a personified figure in a robe with a scythe is not new, but what the show does with it is specific. Death, when he appears in Family Guy, is tired. He's overworked. He has physical ailments. He finds human life mildly exhausting to administer. The comedy of an overwhelmed cosmic figure handling the bureaucracy of mortality requires an adult understanding of both what bureaucracy actually feels like and what mortality actually means. Children can appreciate the absurdism. Adults feel the specific joke in a different register. The Brian and Stewie episode from Season 8, which is titled simply Brian and Stewie and which is widely considered the show's most emotionally serious achievement, requires adult experience to fully receive. The episode removes all of the show's usual comic mechanisms. No cutaway gags, no side plots, just two characters in a bank vault for a weekend, and in doing so it arrives at something that is almost impossible to categorize as comedy alone. The moment where Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in his safety deposit box because he has thought about ending his own life is played entirely straight. There are no jokes. Stewie's reaction, the shock, the fear, the love he clearly has for Brian that he cannot entirely articulate is played straight. Adults who have had any experience with depression, with suicidal ideation in themselves or in people they love, feel that scene with a weight that has nothing to do with the cartoon format. Children who watched the episode encountered it as a serious but confusing departure from what they expected. Adults encountered something true. The episode treats Brian's admission with complete seriousness. The show doesn't deflect into a joke. It stays in the discomfort and allows the characters to actually talk about what it means that Brian has a gun as an exit option, and what it means to Stewie that Brian has been carrying that with him. The conversation they have is the most genuinely adult conversation in the show's entire run, and it lands with an adult audience at a level of emotional accuracy that is completely different from the level at which the show's comedy usually operates. The jokes about cancer in the show's run are another category where adult experience creates a completely different reception. Family Guy has made numerous jokes referencing cancer, both as a comic device and as part of character storylines. Adults who have experienced cancer personally, or who have watched someone close to them go through cancer treatment, receive those jokes in a completely different register than people who have not had that experience. For adults with that experience, the jokes about cancer are always doing something more complex than simple transgression, because the transgression is against something they know at a personal level. The dark comedy of a cancer joke, when it works because it finds something true about the experience of living with or alongside a terminal diagnosis, something about the dark absurdity of the way life continues to make its ordinary demands while something catastrophic is happening simultaneously. The episodes that deal with aging are another adult death-adjacent category. The show periodically looks at what happens to people as they age, at the indignities and losses that accumulate, at the gap between how old someone feels internally and what their body actually does. These episodes function as comedy on the surface, but contain observations about aging that only land with full force if you have started to experience what aging actually feels like. Adults in their 40s and 50s watching those episodes feel the jokes in ways that adults in their 20s don't yet, and children don't at all. The Stewie kills Lois and Lois kills Stewie two-parter from Season 6, while it ultimately resets to a simulation, deals directly with murder and its aftermath in ways that require adult moral processing to fully engage with. The show explores what would actually happen if someone were killed, what the emotional and social and practical consequences would be with more seriousness than you might expect. Adults who have thought about mortality and violence and consequence as real things feel the episode's exploration differently than children who receive it as high-stakes cartoon adventure. The car accident that kills Brian in Life of Brian from Season 12 is a particularly adult moment because of how it's staged. Brian is hit by a car while playing in the street. His injuries are graphic enough for a children's cartoon, but not gratuitously so. And then the family gathers around him while he says goodbye. And the show allows that moment to be what it is, which is a scene about watching something you love die, about the specific and terrible experience of being present for the end of a life. Adults who have been present for the deaths of beloved animals or who have watched someone die feel the emotional texture of that scene in a way that children can't access without that experience. That the show undoes it several episodes later with time travel is its own kind of adult cynicism about how permanent things rarely are in television storytelling. The dark joke that runs through the entire show about the life expectancy of working-class Americans, about the specific health consequences of Peter's lifestyle, his weight, his drinking, his diet, his stress, is an adult background anxiety. The show periodically reminds you that by actuarial standards, Peter should not be doing as well as he's doing. The heart attack jokes, the stroke jokes, the diabetes jokes, the various medical scare episodes contain a dark running commentary on what American life expectancy actually looks like for men of Peter's age, weight, and class. Adults who have experienced health scares themselves or watched their fathers and uncles navigate middle-aged health crises recognize what the show is quietly observing. Children see a fat man being funny about food. The jokes about funerals and grief are another adult-specific category. When the show attends funerals, which it does periodically, the specific jokes about funeral culture, the social dynamics of grief, the way different people process loss differently, the specific rituals and their sometimes hollow relationship to actual mourning, require adult experience of loss to receive fully. Children who haven't been to many funerals don't have the background to understand what's being satirized. Adults who have attended multiple funerals in their lives and have processed what those experiences meant recognize the observations the show is making. Section 8. The relationship and infidelity humor that required emotional history. There is a layer of Family Guy humor built specifically around the things that can go wrong between people who love each other, and this layer requires a certain amount of romantic and relational history to receive. The jokes about jealousy, about betrayal, about the specific fears that accumulate in committed relationships are calibrated for an audience that has experienced some version of these things. The infidelity references throughout the show are handled with a complexity that children can't access. The show understands that infidelity is not a simple act, but an event with a complex set of causes and an even more complex set of consequences. The jokes that touch on this dynamic, whether in Peter and Lois's relationship or in the lives of secondary characters, are drawing on an accurate understanding of what betrayal in a committed relationship actually looks and feels like, which requires adult relational experience to recognize. The jealousy humor, particularly Peter's jealousy, is a specific adult emotional experience rendered as comedy. Jealousy in a long relationship, the particular kind that arises not from any real threat, but from the accumulated insecurity of years of wondering whether your partner's life with you is as interesting as their life might be with someone else, is an emotion that adults in long relationships know from the inside. When Peter sees Lois interacting with another man, and his reaction is immediate and outside and somewhat embarrassing even to him, adults who have felt that specific involuntary jealousy recognize it in a way that children, who haven't had the experience of watching someone they love give their attention to someone else, simply can't. The Cleveland and Loretta storyline, which involves Cleveland's wife having an affair with Quagmire, is handled with more complexity than the show's typical approach might suggest. The episodes that deal with that storyline contain genuinely adult observations about how affairs happen, what drives people to betray their partners, and what the discovery does to everyone involved. Adults who have had experience with infidelity in their relationships or in the relationships of people they know recognize the emotional accuracy underneath the comedy. The joke is there, but so is something real. The Quagmire backstory episodes, particularly the ones that reveal what Quagmire's life looks like from the inside rather than from the outside, contain an unexpected emotional depth that only registers with adult viewers. There's a Quagmire who is not the joke he presents to the world, a man who has built an elaborate performance around sexual pursuit, specifically because genuine emotional intimacy is something he doesn't know how to do or doesn't trust himself to be capable of. Adults who have known or been in relationships with people who use sexual conquest as a substitute for connection recognize that psychological portrait very precisely. The episode about Quagmire's abusive relationship with his sister's boyfriend, which ends with Quagmire killing the abuser to protect his sister, is the show at its most genuinely dark in terms of adult relationship content. Domestic abuse is handled in the episode with a combination of dark comedy and genuine seriousness that requires an adult understanding of the subject to receive properly. Children who don't have the framework for what domestic abuse actually looks and feels like, for the specific dynamics and cycles involved, for why people stay in situations that are destroying them, can't access the serious content underneath the comedy. Adults who have encountered domestic abuse in their own lives or in the lives of people they love feel the episode differently. The Brian romance storylines form their own extended meditation on adult romantic failure that is written for people who have experienced it. Brian keeps falling for women who are wrong for him in specific ways, and the specific ways they're wrong for him are always revealing something real about Brian's own psychology. The pattern of falling for unavailability, for youth that is flattered by his attention but not genuinely interested in him, for women who want different things than he does, is an accurate portrait of how certain adults repeatedly seek the same unfulfilling romantic experiences. Adults who recognize that pattern, either in themselves or in people they know, find Brian's love life quietly resonant in ways that transcend the comedy. Lois's backstory of having been more adventurous before marriage surfaces periodically and always carries an adult charge. The specific experience of being the person a partner chose to settle down with while knowing you were not the wildest chapter of their history is something that many adults have experienced. The show handles Peter's complicated feelings about Lois's past with a mixture of comedy and emotional accuracy that only adults who have navigated similar feelings can fully appreciate. Section 9. The hidden adult content embedded in scenes that looked innocent. Some of the most sophisticated adult humor in Family Guy's history exists not in the obvious jokes, but in the background details, the throwaway lines, the things that registered on your eye or ear without you quite knowing why. These are the jokes that were placed specifically for adults who were paying attention, embedded inside scenes that children would receive as completely straightforward. The music choices across the show's run are frequently adult jokes in themselves. When the show places a specific song in a specific emotional context, it's often making a comment about that song's cultural meaning, its history, its associations, that requires familiarity with the song beyond just having heard it. The Conway Twitty segments are the most explicit version of this, but the music humor runs throughout the show in subtler forms, using songs' actual cultural weight and meaning as part of the joke in ways that only register if you have that cultural background. The background details and shots have been a vehicle for adult humor throughout the show's history. The show's production team has consistently placed visual jokes, readable signs, background events that are entirely separate from the foreground comedy and that are often only visible to adult viewers who are looking at the whole frame rather than just tracking the action. These background jokes tend to reference adult concerns, adult cultural references, adult situations, and they are placed there specifically for the people in the audience who are paying close enough attention to find them. The film and television references that show up in character names, in episode titles, in background details, in specific dialogue choices, require an adult cultural reference library to catch. When the show names something in a way that references a specific obscure film from 1975 or a television episode from 1987, it is placing a marker for the adults in the audience who will recognize it, while the scene continues to function normally for everyone else. The specific ways that minor characters are written and voiced often contain adult jokes in themselves. Herbert the Neighbor is the most extreme example of this, but the principle extends throughout the show's supporting cast. Characters who appear briefly often have backstories implied through their brief dialogue that are entirely adult and entirely invisible to children, because children don't have the cultural reference points to understand what's being implied. Herbert himself deserves extended attention because he represents perhaps the most complex and the most uncomfortable example of adult-only humor in the show's entire run. Herbert is an elderly neighbor whose attraction to young boys, particularly to Chris, is the basis of his character. For children watching the show, Herbert is a strange old man who says odd things. For adults, the character is doing something considerably more complicated. The show is making jokes about pedophilia through a character who is presented as pathetic and ridiculous rather than threatening, and the specific comedy structure requires an adult understanding both of what pedophilia actually is and of the specific way predators often present themselves to communities, hiding in plain sight behind an old and harmless exterior. The joke that the entire Griffin household fails to recognize what Herbert is, despite his complete transparency about his feelings whenever he encounters the children, is itself an adult observation about the way communities sometimes fail to recognize or act on obvious danger because the package it comes in doesn't match their mental model of what that danger looks like. An old man in a rocking chair with a cane who moves slowly and talks softly doesn't match the stranger danger image that most people have been taught to fear. Herbert exists as a satire of exactly that disconnect, and that satire requires adult processing to receive. Children hear a strange old man saying weird things. Adults hear something darker. The Meg moments that are placed to be almost unbearable for adult viewers are scattered throughout the show's run in ways that children process very differently. When the show shows Meg being genuinely mistreated by her family and the treatment is presented as comedy, adults who are paying attention feel a discomfort that children don't. That discomfort comes from recognizing that the thing being played for laughs is a portrait of genuine childhood neglect and emotional abuse, dressed up in cartoon packaging. Adults who understand what neglect looks like in real families, who understand the long-term consequences of a child being treated as fundamentally worthless by the people who are supposed to love them unconditionally, cannot watch those Meg segments with the same emotional neutrality that a child brings to them. The Bonnie Swanson jokes about her pregnancy, which extended for an almost comically long time before she finally gave birth, contain an adult layer about pregnancy's effect on women's bodies, autonomy, and identities that is entirely invisible to children. The show uses Bonnie's eternal pregnancy as a running gag, but within that running gag are accurate observations about how pregnancy can feel like it colonizes a woman's entire identity, and how the world relates to you primarily as a pregnant person rather than as a complete individual, when you've been visibly pregnant for a long time. Adults who have experienced pregnancy or observed it closely recognize what's being accurately reflected underneath the absurdism. The jokes about Joe Swanson's disability start as respectful and become increasingly complex over the show's run. The early Joe jokes are about a man whose identity is not defined by his disability, who is capable and respected and central to his friend group. The later Joe jokes, as the show progressively uses his disability more as a punchline, trace a specific arc that adult viewers who pay attention to how disability is represented in media can observe and evaluate. The shift from Joe as a complete person who happens to use a wheelchair to Joe as a figure whose disability is increasingly the focus of the comedy directed at him reflects something real about how disability is often handled in entertainment, and adults who are aware of that representational dynamic see it happening in real time across the show's seasons. Section 10. Stewie's dark adult subtext and what was really happening underneath. Stewie Griffin is the character that adult viewers and child viewers processed most differently, and the gap between those two receptions is one of the most interesting features of the show's entire run. Children watched an evil baby who was funny because babies aren't supposed to talk like that. Adults watched a character who was doing several different and considerably more complex things simultaneously. The earliest versions of Stewie, from the first 2 seasons in particular, are doing something very specific with villainy and megalomania that requires an adult reference library to fully appreciate. Stewie talks and acts like the villains in a specific lineage of British entertainment. The theatrical villain of classic film and television, the Roger Moore-era Bond villain, the specific theatrical register of someone who has decided that their own superiority is so obvious that they can afford to monologue about it. Seth MacFarlane has described the character as an evil Rex Harrison, which is a reference that immediately narrows the intended adult audience to people old enough to have a strong sense of who Rex Harrison was and what he represented as a cultural type. The world domination plots themselves are adult jokes about the nature of ambition and power. The absurdity of a 1-year-old baby wanting to conquer the world is funny on its surface. The slightly deeper joke is about what drives all ambition, which is an essentially infantile desire for control over an environment that feels uncontrollable. Every person who has ever felt the need to assert total control over their circumstances, who has felt that the world would be better if it simply did what they wanted it to do, is somewhere in Stewie's characterization. Adults who recognize that impulse in themselves or in other adults find the character funny in a way that is self-aware and slightly uncomfortable. Children just see a baby being funny. Stewie's rage at Lois, his obsessive desire to harm or eliminate the person who is supposed to be the primary source of love and safety in his life, is an adult psychological observation. The specific dynamic of ambivalence toward a parent, of loving someone and resenting them simultaneously, of directing the most intense hostility toward the person whose approval matters most, is an adult psychological experience that the show renders in its most extreme possible form. Adults who have processed complicated relationships with their parents, or who have done any amount of psychological reading, recognize what Stewie's obsession with Lois is a cartoon version of. Children see a funny baby being evil about his mom. The gradual revelation of Stewie's sexuality, which begins as jokes and develops across multiple seasons into something more substantial, is handled as adult content throughout. The show uses Stewie's identity exploration as an extended meditation on the specific experience of someone who knows something about themselves that doesn't fit the world's expectations, and who manages that knowledge through performance and eccentricity and, occasionally, through hostility. The season 16 episode Send in Stewie Please, which takes place almost entirely in a therapy session and was broadcast without commercial interruption, is the show's most adult engagement with these themes. Stewie in a therapy session talking about identity, about the performance of selfhood, about the gap between who he is in public and what he actually knows about himself, is an episode that requires adult experience of self-examination and therapy to fully receive. The British accent itself is an adult joke that only lands fully once it's revealed to be a performance. Stewie has been performing a version of himself for the entire show's run. The accent he speaks in is not his natural voice, but a character he has constructed to give himself a specific kind of authority and distance from his actual feelings. The reveal in Send in Stewie Please that the accent is a construction, and that the therapist, who is himself British, cannot tell the difference, is a joke about the lengths people go to present a version of themselves that feels safer than their actual interior life. That observation is entirely adult. Seth MacFarlane has spoken in multiple interviews about the original plan for Stewie, which was to have a Season 3 episode where Stewie comes out of the closet after a near-death experience. The show's unexpected cancellation meant that episode never aired, and when the show returned, the decision was made to keep Stewie's sexuality ambiguous, because the ambiguity allowed for more creative freedom. The creative decision to maintain ambiguity is itself an adult creative and thematic choice, about the difference between resolved identity and the more accurate and complex experience of identity as something in ongoing negotiation. Adults who have thought about identity as a process rather than a destination understand what the ongoing ambiguity of Stewie's characterization is exploring. Children see it as funny weirdness and move on. The Stewie and Brian relationship, which becomes the emotional center of the show from around Season 4 onward, is an adult friendship story. What makes it work as an adult story is not what it shares with children's friendship narratives, but what it doesn't share with them. Mom. Stewie and Brian's relationship is complicated, sometimes unpleasant, built on genuine affection and genuine conflict, marked by moments of real support and moments of real cruelty. It is a portrait of the kind of friendship adults actually have, where love and aggravation coexist in the same space, and where neither person is always right. The Road to Episodes, which are the show's most sustained explorations of this relationship, are adult buddy stories that happen to feature a baby and a dog. The Season 8 episode that traps Brian and Stewie in the bank vault together and strips away all the show's usual comic machinery to leave them in genuine conversation is the culmination of everything adult in their relationship. When Brian reveals why he has the gun, Stewie's response, the shock, the love, the inadequacy of words in that moment, is an accurate portrait of what it feels like to learn that someone you love has been carrying something that dark without your knowledge. Adults who have had that experience, who have been the person who didn't know and then found out, or who have been the person who finally said the thing they'd been carrying, recognize the emotional accuracy of that moment in a way that bypasses the cartoon format entirely. The show's relationship with Stewie's genius, which is used sometimes as a comedy tool and sometimes as something more, is another adult-specific layer. The specific experience of being significantly more capable or aware than the people around you and being unable to communicate that effectively because of your social position is something adults who have felt intellectually underestimated or professionally undervalued recognize in Stewie's situation. The joke is that he's a baby and nobody listens to babies. The feeling underneath the joke is something considerably more universal and adult. The final evolution of Stewie, the one who exists in later seasons and who has left behind most of the original evil genius characterization, is himself a meditation on how people change when they allow relationships to matter to them more than their self-protective strategies. The evil Stewie kept everyone at arm's length behind a wall of hostility and megalomania. The later Stewie, who has genuine feelings about Brian, who is capable of sacrifice and love and vulnerability, has exchanged the safety of his fortress for the danger of actual connection. Adults who have made that exchange in their own lives, who have chosen vulnerability over self-protection at some cost, understand what's happened to Stewie in a way that goes considerably deeper than the surface comedy. Section 11. The jokes that were specifically about being an adult, compressed into brief moments. There is a category of Family Guy joke that is so specifically about adult experience that its entire function is compressed into a few seconds or even a single line, requiring no explanation. If you have the adult experience it references, and making almost no sense whatsoever if you don't. These brief adult moment jokes are perhaps the purest form of the show's two-audience comedy. Peter waking up at 3 in the morning worried about something he has no control over is a joke that requires adult experience to process. The specific texture of adult insomnia, the way the mind at 3 in the morning takes any available anxiety and amplifies it to maximum, is something children don't experience, because children's anxieties are usually things that can be addressed by the morning. Adults who have lain in the dark at 3 in the morning running calculations about things they cannot fix until Wednesday find those moments immediately recognizable. The jokes about going to the doctor and the specific performance involved in answering questions honestly while also managing shame are adult humor. The specific dynamic of being in a medical appointment and knowing you're going to undercount how much you drink or overcount how much you exercise is something adults with established health habits recognize immediately. Children don't yet have enough medical appointment history to know that the conversation involves active performance management. The tax jokes, when they appear, are among the most specifically adult of all the show's humor. There is something about the arrival of a specific tax form or the realization that a certain deduction won't work that is completely adult-specific as an emotional experience. Children have no framework for the specific variety of dread that certain financial documents create in adults. The show can reference that dread in a single image or a single line, and every adult in the audience feels it instantly. The humor about being tired in a way that sleep doesn't quite fix, which becomes more prominent in the show as the characters age, is another adult-specific register. The specific tiredness of responsible adult life, the tiredness that comes not from not sleeping enough but from carrying things for long enough, is something that only adults recognize. Children are tired from not sleeping enough. Adults are tired in a different and larger way that the show captures in small moments of deadness behind Peter or Lois's eyes. The jokes about wanting to be somewhere else while being exactly where you chose to be are adult observations about the experience of living the life you selected. The specific disappointment of getting what you wanted and finding that it's both exactly right and not quite enough, that the life you built is genuinely good and still manages to fall slightly short of the life you imagined, is an adult emotional experience that appears in small moments throughout the show without ever being the main subject of an episode. The background detail jokes about consumer culture and advertising, about the specific way adult American life is shaped and mediated by commercial forces, are adult observations compressed into visual jokes. Adults who have spent enough time in the consumer economy recognize what the show is quietly pointing at when it frames certain products or advertisements in certain ways. Children see products and advertisements as neutral. Adults see a comment on what it means that adult life is organized around them. The jokes about getting older that aren't about the body but about identity, about realizing that you are now the age you used to think of as definitely an adult and feeling not entirely sure that you qualify, are perhaps the most recognizable adult-specific moments in the show. Peter's moments of confronting the gap between who he thought he'd be by now and who he actually is, between the dreams of his younger self and the shape of his actual life, are compressed adult observations about the experience of middle age that children cannot access because they haven't yet had the experience of arriving at an age they once thought was distant and finding themselves still, fundamentally confused about what they're supposed to be doing. The quiet moments in the show, which are rarer and therefore more precious, where characters sit alone for a moment and the music changes slightly and the comedy drops away for just a beat, are the most adult moments of all. In those brief pauses, the show acknowledges that the people it's making jokes about are also actual people carrying actual weight, and adults who know what that weight feels like in their own lives receive those pauses as recognition. Children wait for the next joke. Adults feel something land in that silence. Closing. What Family Guy was really doing all along. What all of this adds up to is something that Family Guy has rarely received credit for, because the show's loudest elements have always defined the conversation around it. The show was not, and has never been, only what it looked like on the surface. It was a show about adult life doing what adult life rarely gets to do, which is laugh at its own texture, its own anxieties, its own specific disappointments and surprises and absurdities, in a setting that gave people permission to receive those observations as comedy rather than as self-pity. The kids who watched Family Guy in the 1999 premiere, and the kids who discovered it in later years on Adult Swim or on streaming platforms, were getting a different show than their parents were. Their parents were watching a program that understood very precisely what adult life felt like and had found a way to make comedy out of that understanding. The kids were watching a cartoon with a funny fat guy and an evil baby. Both of them were right about what they saw. The show contains both things. That's what made it genuinely interesting for the years when it was genuinely interesting. The best version of Family Guy was a show that could make a child laugh at something they didn't understand and make an adult feel understood by something that was making them laugh. That double operation, that two-frequency broadcast, is harder to execute than it looks, and the show did it well enough, for long enough, that tens of millions of people organized meaningful amounts of their entertainment life around it. And now, years later, listening to all of those jokes walked through slowly in the dark, at whatever hour you're at, in whatever place you're in, you can hear all the things that were always there, underneath the giggity and the cutaway gags and the chicken fights. A show that understood you. A show that was always talking to you, specifically, even when you thought it was just being stupid. Which, when you think about it, is a pretty good description of the best comedy that's ever been made. If this was a good night for you, leave a like before you close your eyes. It means more than you'd think. And if you subscribe, we'll keep these long, slow walks through the things that meant something coming as often as we can make them. Sleep well, wherever you are and whatever time it is. End of script. Section 12. The show's relationship with class, aspiration, and the American dream. There's a current running through Family Guy that rarely gets discussed in the typical conversation about the show, and that current is about class. Not in the obvious way, not just because Peter is working class and occasionally makes observations about money. The class content in Family Guy runs deeper than that, embedded in the specific texture of how people in the show talk about their lives, their expectations, their sense of what they deserve and what they can realistically expect to get. Peter Griffin represents a very specific American demographic that was, during the show's early run, increasingly anxious about its own position. The white working-class man in the post-industrial American Northeast, the man whose father had a union job and whose grandfather had a union job, and who is now watching the kind of employment that gave those men dignity and security become something more precarious and more contingent, is Peter's actual demographic. The comedy the show wrings out of that demographic is not always kind, but it is usually accurate. The specific way Peter relates to ambition is an adult class joke. He doesn't really have any. He doesn't read self-improvement books or attend networking events or pursue promotions in a sustained way. His pleasures are simple: beer at the bar, television on the couch, his friends, his family, and the show plays this sometimes as comedy and sometimes as something sadder, because Peter's contentment with his relatively modest life exists in a culture that insists the failure to want more is itself a kind of failure. Adults from working-class backgrounds recognize the specific social discomfort of not having the kind of ambition that more affluent social contexts have decided is a universal virtue. Lois's family, the Pewterschmidts, represent old money, inherited wealth, the specific kind of American aristocracy built on industry fortunes from several generations back. Carter Pewterschmidt is himself an extended adult joke about a certain kind of wealthy American patriarch, contemptuous of Peter's class origins, contemptuous of his daughter's choice, managing his disdain through a particular kind of patrician condescension that children don't have enough class experience to recognize as the specific social register it is. Adults who have encountered this type, or who have been looked down on by this type, feel the Carter jokes with a specific sting that the cartoon packaging softens but doesn't quite remove. The tension between Lois's background and Peter's, the fact that she married down in purely economic terms, and that this choice continues to reverberate through their social lives, is a sustained adult class observation. The Pewterschmidt world, with its country clubs and its inherited expectations and its reflexive certainty that money confers judgment, exists in permanent contrast to the drunken clam world, and Lois navigates between these two worlds in ways that adults who have married across class lines recognize very precisely. The specific social rituals of Peter's friend group, the way the four men at the drunken clam interact, the things they talk about and don't talk about, the particular emotional economy of male working-class friendship in which vulnerability is managed and often disguised, is an adult social observation. Adults who grew up in similar social environments know what those friendships look and feel like from the inside. The loyalty, the humor as protective armor, the things that are never said directly because some things don't get said directly in that context. Children watching those scenes see four adults being funny together. Adults see a portrait of a specific social formation, the aspirational jokes in the show, the episodes where the Griffins suddenly have money or suddenly have access to a social world they don't normally inhabit, consistently return to the same underlying comedy, which is that the Griffins don't know the codes and customs of that world and are revealed as outsiders by their ignorance of the right gestures and language. This is a classic comedic structure, but Family Guy's version of it contains something sharper than typical fish-out-of-water comedy because it's specifically about the way class knowledge works, the way you learn not just how to dress, but how to talk and where to look and what to care about, and the way that learning is largely invisible to the people who have it because they've always had it. Adults who have navigated class transitions in their own lives recognize that specific invisibility very precisely. The joke about Peter trying to fit in with wealthy people and failing because he doesn't understand the social rules contains an adult observation about how class mobility works and how it doesn't. It's not just about money. It's about the whole cultural package that comes with money, the tastes, the references, the instincts, the automatic calibrations about behavior in different social contexts that people who grew up with money internalize so early that they don't even know they have them. Peter keeps getting the surface wrong because he doesn't have access to the grammar underneath the surface. Adults who have navigated similar experiences know exactly what that gap feels like. The New England setting is itself a class observation. Rhode Island is a small state with a very specific social history, heavily shaped by Catholic immigrant communities, by the decline of textile manufacturing, by the contrast between the old Yankee wealth of the coastal towns and the working-class communities that grew up around the factories. The show's choice of setting is not arbitrary. It places the Griffins in a very specific American social geography with a very specific class history, and adults from that part of the country, or who know that part of the country, recognize what the setting is doing that people from elsewhere don't. The specific jokes about shopping at certain stores versus certain other stores, about eating at certain restaurants versus certain other restaurants, about driving certain cars versus certain other cars, are all class signaling jokes that adults with class awareness receive immediately. The The show is constantly mapping its characters' class positions through their consumer choices, and adults who understand the class grammar of consumer behavior in American life follow that mapping instinctively. Children just see people going places and buying things. The American Dream content in the show, which surfaces periodically in different forms, is always slightly dark. The dream in Family Guy is something people still believe in, or at least perform belief in, while the actual evidence around them suggests something more complicated. Peter's American Dream is his family, his house, his job, his friends, his beer. It's modest by most American Dream standards. And the show consistently suggests that this modest version, while humble, is also real, while the larger advertised version is something that functions more as ideology than as actual destination. Adults who have spent enough time watching the advertised version of the American Dream from the outside know what the show is quietly saying about it. Section 13. The show's media and television satire that required being a television watcher. Family Guy is, among its other things, a show about watching television and about what watching television does to people and to culture. The media satire in the show is sophisticated enough that it rewards adult viewers who have spent enough time thinking about how media works to appreciate what the show is doing. The show's relationship with Fox, its own broadcast network, is one of the most unusual dynamics in American television history, because Fox continued to renew and broadcast a show that frequently and publicly criticized the network and its parent company's associated media properties. The jokes the show makes about Fox are themselves adult media jokes, requiring you to know that Fox News exists, to understand its political orientation and content strategy, and to find the irony of a satirical comedy airing on a network that also broadcasts its ideological opposite amusing rather than merely confusing. The episode where Peter threatens to stop watching Fox unless the network cancels a show he hates, only to be told by an executive that the network will survive his withdrawal, is a meditation on the powerlessness of individual viewers in their relationship with media corporations. Adults who have felt the specific impotence of being a viewer who cares about what they watch and who realizes that their individual relationship with a broadcast network is essentially non-existent, find that episode hitting something true. Children see a funny argument. Adults see an observation about who actually has power in the media relationship. The news satire running through the show, primarily through Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons, and later through different news team configurations, is specific enough to require familiarity with the conventions and culture of local television news. The specific combination of performed gravitas and actual smallness that defines local television news, the way anchors treat stories of wildly different importance with identical emotional registers, the specific social ecosystem of a local news team, these are all adult media observations that only land if you've watched enough local television news to understand what's being exaggerated. The show's self-awareness about its own structure, the moments when characters acknowledge they are on a television show or comment on the show's own conventions, is one of the more sophisticated forms of media commentary in the series. These moments require the viewer to be watching the show as media rather than simply watching the show, to have enough critical distance from the experience of television consumption to recognize when the show is making an observation about the form rather than just using the form. Adults who think about what they watch are the audience for that kind of meta-commentary. Children who watch without critical distance don't have access to the second layer. The South Park rivalry and the Cartoon Wars episodes from South Park's run, which directly criticized Family Guy's writing style and creative approach, produced an interesting moment in television history where two competing shows were explicitly debating each other's artistic choices in the form of comedy. Adults who followed both shows and who cared about the craft questions being raised found the Cartoon Wars episode sharply engaging as media criticism. Children who watched either show without that context just saw one show making fun of another show, which is funny but not the same thing. The episode referencing the Adult Swim relationship, where a character notes that the show is different on Adult Swim because it's less censored there, is a specific adult media joke about the economics of broadcast standards and cable standards and the different regulatory environments that shape what can be shown in different distribution contexts. Adults who understand how broadcast content regulation works in America find the joke precise and funny. Children see a character saying something about a channel they may not have access to. The internet virality jokes scattered throughout the show's run are fascinating adult media observations because they track the emergence of internet video culture in real time. The show began in 1999, before YouTube existed, and ran through the entire emergence of video sharing, social media, and the new kinds of celebrity and attention economics that these platforms created. The jokes the show makes about viral content, about what makes something shareable, about the relationship between a television show and its clips when clips become the primary way people engage with the content, are media industry observations that only adults following the entertainment business recognize as the real observations they are. The product placement jokes, which the show has used both sincerely and satirically at different points, are adult media commentary about the economics of broadcast television and the increasingly permeable line between content and advertising. Adults who pay attention to how television is funded and how that funding shapes what appears on screen recognize what the show is doing when it comments on its own commercial relationships. Children see a brand being mentioned or a product appearing in a scene. The awards show satire, including the memorable moment where Seth MacFarlane hosted the Academy Awards and incorporated Family Guy-style humor into a format that emphatically did not welcome it, reflects something real about the cultural space that animated comedy occupies in the broader entertainment hierarchy. The jokes the show makes about Emmys and prestige and critical recognition are adult industry jokes about the specific ways comedy, and particularly animated comedy, gets evaluated and rewarded, or doesn't, by the establishments that confer legitimacy. Adults who follow the entertainment industry find those jokes precise. Children just hear awards being mentioned. Section 14. What the show got right about friendship and male emotional life. There is a layer of Family Guy that is specifically about how certain kinds of men experience friendship and emotional life, and this layer requires adult experience with those social formations to receive. The show's portrait of male friendship, specifically working-class male friendship in the American tradition, is one of its most consistently accurate observations and one of its most consistently overlooked ones. Peter, Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland form a friend group that is bound together by routine more than by deep mutual knowledge, by the habit of being at the same bar on the same nights, rather than by the kind of vulnerability-based intimacy that gets associated with close friendship in the contemporary therapeutic model. And the show is quite honest about the fact that this kind of friendship is nonetheless real, that the presence and continuity and the low-grade mutual affection of the bar friendship carries its own kind of meaning, even if it doesn't involve much emotional disclosure. Adults from working-class backgrounds, or adults who have been part of or observed bar-based social formations, recognize the specific emotional grammar of how Peter and his friends interact. They don't talk about their feelings directly. They talk around their feelings through humor and through teasing and through the kinds of minor crises that provide an indirect avenue for care to be expressed. When one of them is in trouble, the others show up, not with emotional language, but with presence. The care is there, but it travels in a different vehicle than the therapeutic model would prescribe, and adults who have been part of those kinds of friendships know that the care is real, even in the unfamiliar vehicle. The Cleveland Brown dynamic, particularly in the early seasons, is an adult friendship observation about the specific experience of being the one person of color in a predominantly white male friend group. The particular negotiations Cleveland navigates, the things he absorbs without comment, the moments when the humor of his friends crosses into territory that sits differently for him than it does for them, are observations that adults who have either been in that position or who have observed it closely recognize. The show is never entirely comfortable examining this dynamic directly, but the discomfort it doesn't quite address is itself an adult observation about how those friendships actually work in America. Joe Swanson's friendship with the group is another adult observation about how disability gets managed in male friendships that aren't equipped for it. The group accommodates Joe without ever really engaging with what his life is actually like. His disability is acknowledged through their adjustments to how they physically move through the world with him, but the emotional content of what it means to be a police officer who can no longer do the physical work of policing, of what it means to have a marriage that is under strain in ways connected to his disability, of what it means to watch your friends do things your body won't do, is never directly addressed. Adults who have navigated friendships with someone dealing with significant health challenges recognize that emotional avoidance very precisely. The show's treatment of what happens to male friendships when life circumstances change significantly is an adult observation about adult friendship mortality. Cleveland's departure for his own show is a cartoon production decision, but within the show's fiction it represents the thing that happens to adult friendships all the time, which is that one person moves or one person's life changes in a significant way, and the group reorganizes around the absence and is never quite the same. Adults who have watched friend groups reorganize after someone moves away, or after a relationship change, or after a new job or a child, feel the Cleveland departure as something they recognize, beneath the comedy. The bar itself, the Drunken Clam, is an adult institution in ways that children don't fully understand. The bar, as a social space for adult men in certain communities, functions as something much more than a place to drink. It's a social infrastructure, a place where a certain kind of adult male life gets organized and maintained and given some of its meaning. Adults who have belonged to or observed that kind of social infrastructure understand what the Drunken Clam represents to Peter and his friends. It's not just a bar. It's where their social identities get confirmed, and where they get to be themselves in a specific way that other social contexts don't allow. The friendship humor in the show consistently works best when it's most honest about the emotional limitations of how these particular men relate to each other. The jokes where one of them is clearly upset about something, and the others either don't notice or notice and choose not to address it directly, are adult observations about the specific emotional protocols of certain male friendships. Adults who know those protocols recognize them. The humor comes from the recognition, from the accuracy, from the familiar texture of a social dynamic that many adults have been part of without ever having had it named or depicted quite this precisely. Section 15. Everything that was really being said about parents and children. The most sustained adult observation in Family Guy's entire run is about parenthood, not about cartoon parenthood. Not about the specific adventures that happen to cartoon parents with cartoon children. About the real thing. About what it feels like to be responsible for a person who didn't ask to be born, who is watching you every day for how to be a person, who will carry whatever you give them into their own adult life regardless of whether you meant to give it. Peter as a parent is a comedy character, but he's also a meditation on a specific kind of parenting failure that is not malicious but is nonetheless real. He is not a cruel father out of intent. He is a neglectful father out of distraction and immaturity, and the fundamental gap between what fatherhood requires and what Peter is actually capable of providing at any given moment. Adults who have parented, or who have been parented by this type of person, recognize the specific texture of that kind of parenting. It is not dramatic abuse. It is the smaller and in some ways harder thing, the consistent minor absence, the missed moments, the attention that gets given to other things first, and to the children with what's left over. Lois as a parent contains a different kind of adult complexity. She is the competent parent, the one who actually holds the family together, who knows where things are and who needs what and when each child is struggling and why. But she also has her own life, her own desires, her own needs that are in constant competition with the demands of parenting, and the specific exhaustion of being the competent parent in a household where the other parent is not an equal partner in that competence is something that adults who have been in that position understand very precisely. Lois is funny as a cartoon character. She is also a portrait of something many adults have experienced or observed. Meg's experience of her parents is the darkest version of the parenting content. The specific psychology of a child who has received the consistent message from her parents that she is less valuable and less important than the other claims on their attention is rendered in Meg's characterization with more accuracy than the comedy framing usually acknowledges. Adults who grew up as the overlooked child in their family, or who had to watch a sibling be the overlooked child, or who have professional experience with the consequences of parental neglect, find Meg's situation recognizable in ways that go well beyond cartoon entertainment. The episodes where Peter and Lois have to be honest with themselves about what kind of parents they are, the moments when their failures are directly addressed rather than deflected into comedy, are the show at its most genuinely adult in this category. The Seahorse Seashell Party episode, where Meg finally confronts her family, is ostensibly resolved by Meg accepting her role as the family's emotional punching bag in order to preserve their stability, which is itself a deeply uncomfortable adult observation about how family systems maintain themselves. The resolution is dark in a way that children receive as satisfying, because order is restored and the discomfort is ended, while adults who have thought about family dynamics recognize it as a portrait of something genuinely pathological. The Stewie-Lois dynamic, in the early seasons when it was the show's most original relationship, is itself an adult observation about parenthood. The dramatic irony of a parent who has no idea that her child wants to harm her, who picks up and holds the very creature plotting her destruction, is funny as a cartoon premise. But it also contains something true about the fundamental gap in parental knowledge. Parents don't fully know their children. The inner life of a child is largely opaque to even the most attentive parent, and Stewie's secret plots against Lois are an exaggeration of the reality that children are always partially hidden from their parents, even from parents who think they know everything. Chris Griffin's story across the show's run is the least developed of the children's arcs, but still contains adult content around the specific experience of a boy who is not academically accomplished or socially gifted or conventionally impressive in the ways that parents often measure their children's success, who is kind and interested in art, and somewhat adrift in the specific masculine social formations that his world expects him to fit into. Adults who have navigated that kind of non-fit themselves, or who have parented children who don't fit the expected template, recognize Chris's situation with more depth than the comedy usually foregrounds. The flashback jokes about Peter and Lois's parenting history, the moments when the show reveals how they handled specific childhood situations for their kids, are adult jokes about the gap between the parent you intend to be and the parent you actually are when you're tired and distracted and managing your own needs alongside theirs. Adults who have parented know that gap from the inside. The comedy exaggerates it. The underlying truth is something every parent has felt. The show's consistent return to the theme of parents who love their children genuinely, while also consistently failing them in specific ways, is perhaps the most honest and the most adult thing the show ever did. The Griffins are not bad parents the way cartoon villains are bad. They're bad parents the way real people are bad parents, imperfectly and accidentally and out of the same human limitations that shape everything else they do. Adults who have parented, or who have been parented by human beings rather than by idealized television parents, recognize that specific imperfection very precisely. What the show is ultimately saying about parenthood across its whole run and underneath all the comedy is that love is necessary but not sufficient, that you can genuinely love your children and still fail them in significant ways. That intention and outcome are often alarmingly disconnected in parenting. That the people who raise us leave marks on us whether they meant to or not, and that those marks are sometimes from the things they did and sometimes from the things they didn't. Adults who have spent time thinking about how they were shaped by their parents or how they are shaping their own children receive that observation as something real. Children just see a funny family on television. A final word before you sleep. You've come a long way tonight. Through the marriage jokes and the drinking humor, and the sexual content that required lived experience, through the political satire and the celebrity references, and the things embedded in what looked like simple scenes, through the workplace frustration and the mortality comedy and the relationship complexity, through Herbert's dark corner of the show and Stewie's layered identity and Brian's functional despair dressed up as sophistication, through the class observations and the media commentary and the male friendship portrait and the parenting meditations, all of it was there. All of it was always there, running underneath the cartoon like a second signal, broadcasting continuously to anyone who had the adult experience to receive it. Family Guy was never just a show about a fat man and his talking dog. It was a show about the specific texture of adult American life in the turn of the 21st century, about what it felt like to carry the weight of a family and a job and a social identity and a body that was getting older and a world that was getting more complicated, and to find that weight sometimes funny and sometimes not, and sometimes both at the same time. The best comedy has always worked that way. It holds up a mirror that is warped just enough to be funny and accurate enough to be recognized. Family Guy, in its best moments, held up that mirror and caught something true about what it meant to be alive in America in the early 21st century, about what it meant to have children, and a mortgage, and a beer, and a best friend, and a marriage, and a death that was somewhere out there waiting patiently, and all the ordinary, extraordinary, difficult, hilarious sadness of being a person. And it dressed all of that up as a cartoon about a guy named Peter who once fought a giant chicken for reasons that were never entirely explained. Which, if you think about it, is exactly the right way to do it. Subscribe if this found you at the right moment. Leave a comment with where you are and what time it is. And sleep well tonight knowing that someone, somewhere in the writing room of an animated comedy that most critics didn't take seriously, was absolutely paying attention to your life.